Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the DIFC Conference Center. We always appreciate your time and your interest. Today's outreach session is on the new passporting regime put in place a short while ago. On the 12th of November last year, the regulators of the two financial free zones, the DFSA and the FSRA, concluded a regulatory agreement, a protocol, with the onshore securities regulator, the Emirates Securities and Commodities Authority, or ESCA as we like to call it. And this paved the way for a passporting regime for domestic funds established in any one of their jurisdictions to be freely marketed and promoted in the territorial jurisdiction of the others under a unified set of rules agreed to in the protocol. The regulators concerned have since publicly announced on 11th of March this year that following the public consultation and enactment of the relevant legislation and rules, that the new regime is now active and it's available to fund managers and their agents for marketing and promotion of domestic funds in each of those jurisdictions. Given that this is the first time that financial services regulators in the UAE have agreed to a common legislative framework for the provision of financial services across jurisdictional borders and their scopes of authority, it should be recognized and celebrated as a positive step forward. Indeed, there may be many issues, and I'm sure it will come out of the discussion today, that require further attention. And these include the fact that foreign funds weren't included, the fact that public funds would require a local custodian, and if you look at the cost and the practicality of it all, there may still be some issues. But overall, the protocol and the common legislative framework agreed between the different regulators clearly shows certainty can be obtained within the unique legal and regulatory landscape of the UAE, with its multiple regulators and legal systems, where, let's face it, there has been uncertainty in the past, and also the potential for duplication on the part of regulation. The idea of multi-jurisdictional passporting for investment products, in line with what we see in places like the EU under UCITS and AIFMD, has obviously gained mythical status over the past few years. And it took a number of years to negotiate and put in place. But the fact that it has now happened is indicative, in my opinion, of a renewed commitment on the part of all the regulators in the UAE to simplify financial services and the regulatory playing field in the country, and who knows, maybe the region. To discuss the new rules and the new regime, we've basically assembled a panel of experts, probably the finest panel of experts we've ever assembled. And each one of them, I think, has a unique, either had a role or a unique perspective. And from that perspective, obviously, we have Mr. Chris Cameron from the DFSA, who's Associate Director, Supervision, but essentially the man that's sort of taken charge of the funds side of things at DFSA, and I think also to his credit overseeing sort of exponential growth of the domestic funds regime within the DIFC. Next to him we have Divya Gambhir, who's a partner at Altamimi & Company. And one of the things that I can tell you over, say, the past 3 years, that the protocol has been talked about for many years, but the actual sitting down and negotiation and going back and forth, I think, was about the last 3 years. And in many of those instances, we've had deadlocks that sometimes went on for 6 to 8 months, where neither of the parties essentially went forward with it. And in a number of those instances, we always called on Altamimi & Company to go back to the regulator in Abu Dhabi and sort of open up new avenues. So that was a crucial role for them. And then we have Mr. Mark Humbach, who's the Chief Operating Officer of both Gateway Investment Management and InvestBridge Capital. Mark is obviously an old hand at this, previously at the DFSA. He's a qualified lawyer from Germany, but Mark, I think, has seen the funds regime and how people place in this country over a number of years. And then we have Mr. Chris Harron, who's the Executive Director Legal at Arkham Capital. And once again, Chris is an old hand that has seen this both as a leading private practitioner and now within the context of Arkham that has a large presence in the country in terms of funds and funds placement. So that's the panel that we assembled for you. The way that it's going to work is I'm going to sit there with the guys. I've prepared a number of questions for each of them, and I'm going to try and follow, at least in the beginning, a little bit of a discipline to start with Chris Cameron to explain to us essentially what the new regime is within the context of DIFC, and then ask Divya to sort of put that in the context of what was the situation previously in the country and what this has done essentially in that context. And then after that, a little bit more open-ended questions for Chris Harron and Mark. The idea is to solicit open and free discussion. So I may have prepared questions for the panelists, but at some point in time, you are free to basically come in and add to the discussion. Okay, Mr. Cameron. Welcome once again. Can you just explain to us which funds qualify and what is the difference, say, between now protocol fund types and let's call them other DFSA regulated fund types?
Sure. So I think first and foremost, this is a fantastic achievement for the country and also the participants in the DIFC. It enables an entity, a single entity with a single license, to then market domestic funds across the wider country and the other two jurisdictions. So this is an excellent starting point for us. As Jacques mentioned at the outset, at this time, it is limited to domestic funds. So those are funds that are domiciled within the DIFC, and that also equates to our public funds, exempt funds, and qualified investor funds. So all those three categories can essentially be marketed across the wider UAE if you come to the DFSA and register with us. We will be your sole regulatory contact point for that, and in the background we will deal with the other regulators. Slight variation in terminology in terms of fund types. If you look at the DFSA's regulation versus the passporting rules, the fund protocol rules as they're called in our DFSA rules. As I mentioned, we have public, exempt and qualified investor funds. Within the fund protocol rules, you have two fund categories, and that's public funds and private funds. Don't worry, all three of our categories fit neatly within those two categories. So public funds fit straight in, that's retail clients or public offer. And then within the private funds, that also captures both our qualified investor funds and exempt funds. And the criteria to enable that is that it's marketed to professional clients via private placement with a minimum subscription of $50,000, which is the equivalent of our exempt fund criteria, and naturally the QIF fund falls within that, given it's got a $500,000 minimum subscription.
Okay, now, is it if you just set up the fund, does it become automatically passportable, or, is there a process to go through? And, if you can just maybe explain, if, for public and private funds, how that would work.
Sure. So very recently, in the last month to 2 months, we've actually rolled out some online forms within the fund management space. We've created an online form for licensing of managers and then registration of funds. In the last 2 weeks, we've rolled out a further third form, and that's specifically for passporting of funds across the country. We've kept that very much in line with the approach that we've adopted on the fund manager and the fund forms. You will literally start the application process. We will look for you to tell us within that application form who the fund manager is, who the fund is, which of the host jurisdictions that you want to target and market into. You can either market that fund directly, or you can do it indirectly using agents that would need to be licensed in the relevant space as well. So you will outline those to us. Also, you will provide a copy of your prospectus and constitution. Now, we will accept these applications once the fund manager is licensed and once the fund is registered in the DIFC. So already we have that understanding of what you're doing, rapport with you. So I expect the actual passporting fund application to be a very short, streamlined process for you just to highlight to us if there's been any material changes in those documents since the initial submission. So that's how we'll accept the application. In terms of the difference between public and private funds, I would tease out a couple of aspects there. One is, as Jacques mentioned, there is a slight difference with the custodian. So private funds, they're enabled to use the current framework that the DFSA has. So the starting point for a custodian is that it needs to be an eligible custodian. There's an eligibility criteria, so a third party. But you also have the ability to use a self-custody or alternative custodial arrangements, particularly in the property fund space and private equity. So that remains the same for our qualified investor funds and exempt funds in the DIFC. However, for public funds, there is a difference between not only the private and public, but also our current public DFSA regime and passporting. And that is the starting point is that you need to use an ESCA-regulated custodian for custody. Unless, however, it's a property fund, and then you can use the DFSA requirements in that space. The additionals that we would expect you to make in your application for public funds as well, vis-a-vis the private funds, you will not depart from what you've already provided to the DFSA, but there is a difference between private and public. And that is essentially making sure that the vehicle is incorporated and all the formalities around that have been completed. Now, just to put you at ease, we wouldn't actually register a public fund in the first place until that incorporation is complete. So you've already ticked that box, essentially. The other component is that you will require a DFSA or an auditor that's regulated in the home jurisdiction. It's a requirement for any of our funds to have a DFSA registered auditor. So already you've ticked that box when you come into the centre and establish the fund. The third point is that there's a public fund checklist. Now again, we've already got a DFSA public fund checklist in place. There's probably a few more additional requirements in our own rules. The narrative is slightly different, but what we're actually focusing on, the outcomes and the risks that we want you to deal with in our regime versus the passporting regime, there's very little difference. It's just a case of the narrative that's been agreed between the three regulators is slightly different. And then the last point I would mention, the difference between public and private funds, is the need for a KID, so Key Investor Information Document, that we're all aware of being in use in Europe. And in Q4 of last year, we've also introduced that to the DFSA public fund regime. We haven't called it KID, but it's essentially the same document and process that we're looking for. So you've already gone through that process when you established the public fund, but bear in mind there is a difference between the DFSA regime and what we've built out with the other regulators for passporting, and that's the fact that it needs to be in both English and Arabic. So there'll be an additional cost and an additional translation process that you need to go through there. Otherwise, the process remains the same between private and public.